Nicole Kidman has made her first public appearance since her split from Keith Urban.
We've been through a lot together.
We've got a timeline for it now, and the time is now.
There are love stories that the world wants to believe in. Stories so perfectly constructed, so beautifully packaged, that the public clings to them the way a drowning person clings to a lifeline. Nicole Kidman and Keith Urban were exactly that kind of story. For nearly 2 decades, they were the couple that Hollywood cynics could not touch, the golden pair that seemed to prove love was real, enduring, and worth fighting for. Fans adored them. Magazines celebrated them. Award shows became their stage. But now, in the wake of a divorce that stunned the world, something extraordinary is happening. Nicole Kidman, a woman who spent nearly 20 years protecting her private life with quiet, fierce determination, is beginning to speak. And what she is revealing is reshaping everything we thought we knew about one of the most iconic marriages in modern celebrity history. This is not a story about hatred. It is not a story about villains. It is something far more complicated and far more human than that. It is the story of 2 deeply wounded people who found each other at their most vulnerable, built a life together on love and hope and sheer willpower, and ultimately discovered that willpower alone cannot save a marriage when the foundation beneath it has been quietly crumbling for years. It is the story of Nicole Kidman, a woman of extraordinary resilience, finally stepping out from behind the carefully maintained image and telling, in her own way, the truth of what she lived through. To understand what Nicole is now exposing, you have to first understand who she became inside this marriage. Before Keith Urban, Nicole had already survived one of the most brutal public dissolutions in Hollywood history. Her divorce from Tom Cruise left scars that ran deep and wide. She had not only lost a husband, she had lost proximity to the 2 children she had adopted during that marriage, Isabella and Connor. Those who knew her during that period describe a woman who was professionally triumphant but privately devastated. She won the Academy Award for The Hours. She walked every red carpet with composure. She gave interviews that radiated grace. But behind it all, she was nursing wounds that had not fully healed. When Keith came into her life in 2005, something unlocked in her. He was raw, passionate, and openly emotional in ways that Tom had never been. He was a musician who wore his heart on the strings of his guitar, a man who had known struggle and was not ashamed of it. For Nicole, who had spent years inside a marriage that critics describe as suffocating and controlled, Keith felt like air. He felt like freedom. She fell in love not just with a man but with what he represented, the possibility of a different kind of life, warmer, more authentic, more real. But Nicole was not entering this relationship as a carefree woman starting fresh. She was entering it as a woman who had already lost so much and was determined, perhaps desperately so, not to lose again. From the very beginning, she positioned herself as Keith's anchor. When he checked himself into rehab just 4 months after their wedding in 2006, she did not waver. She visited him. She defended him publicly. She absorbed the tabloid speculation with dignified silence. She chose loyalty when lesser partners might have chosen self-protection. And for many years, this role of devoted and unwavering supporter became the defining characteristic of who Nicole Kidman was as a wife. What she is now beginning to expose is just how much that role cost her. There is a particular kind of exhaustion that comes from being the strong one in a relationship for too long. It is not dramatic. It does not announce itself with a single breaking moment. It accumulates quietly, the way water erodes stone, slowly, invisibly, and then all at once the damage is undeniable. Nicole has begun, in careful and measured ways, to speak about that exhaustion. Through sources close to her, a picture is emerging of a woman who spent the better part of 2 decades managing not just her own extraordinary career and the demands of motherhood, but also the emotional and psychological stability of a man who, despite his talent and his charm, never fully conquered the demons that had followed him since his youth. Friends close to Nicole describe a woman who was always bracing for the next crisis. Keith's battle with sobriety, while genuinely courageous, was never fully resolved in the way she had hoped. There were periods of stability, years when the family flourished and the fairy tale seemed not just real but sustainable. But there were also periods of tension, quiet but corrosive, when old patterns resurfaced and the vigilance Nicole had taught herself to maintain shifted from being a loving choice to being an exhausting necessity. She was watching. Always watching. Not because she did not trust him, but because experience had taught her that trust without watchfulness was a luxury she could not afford. What Nicole is now revealing, carefully and without cruelty, is that this dynamic, this persistent imbalance of emotional labor, was one of the central fractures of their marriage. She had been cast, or perhaps had cast herself, in the role of savior. And while Keith genuinely loved her for her strength, he also chafed against it. He wanted to be her equal, not her project. He wanted a marriage in which he was not perpetually positioned as the one who needed saving. That tension, the gap between what she needed to give and what he needed to receive, grew over time into something neither of them could bridge. One of the most striking things about Nicole Kidman and Keith Urban was how effectively they maintained their public image, even as the private reality beneath it was fracturing. For years, they were the couple other couples aspired to be. Their red carpet appearances were warm and tactile. He would hold her hand with visible tenderness. She would lean into him. At award shows, he wept when thanking her. She described him in interviews as the person who brought her back to life. Every public gesture reinforced the mythology that theirs was a love story for the ages. But those who observed them closely began to notice, long before the divorce papers were filed, that something had shifted. The affection was still there, but it had taken on a slightly performative quality, as though both of them were playing roles they had once inhabited naturally but now had to consciously perform. Smiles that had once been spontaneous became composed. Declarations that had once been passionate became practiced. They were not pretending to love each other exactly, but they were performing a version of their marriage that no longer entirely corresponded to the marriage they were actually living. Nicole is now, in her quiet and precise way, pulling back the curtain on that performance. She has spoken, and through sources close to her has further revealed, that their final years together were marked by a growing emotional distance that no amount of public solidarity could close. They were living parallel lives under the same roof and the same brand. She was focused on her daughters, on building a stable and nurturing environment for Sunday Rose and Faith Margaret. He was throwing himself into music with an intensity that bordered on escape, touring relentlessly, pouring into his performances the emotions he could not fully navigate at home. They were both running, just in different directions. When Nicole filed for divorce in Davidson County, Tennessee in late September 2025, citing irreconcilable differences, the legal language was deliberately minimal. But the details within the filing told a story that the careful public image had long obscured. She sought primary residential custody of their 2 daughters. Both parties agreed to waive spousal support and child support, a financial arrangement that insiders say reflects the fact that they had been maintaining largely separate finances for some time. The practicality of the settlement, its lack of surface acrimony, was in some ways more revealing than any dramatic courtroom confrontation would have been. It spoke of a couple who had been quietly disentangling their lives long before the official paperwork was filed. What the documents could not capture, and what Nicole is now beginning to fill in through her words and actions, is the emotional architecture of that decision. This was not a sudden rupture. It was the culmination of years of slow and painful realization. She had stayed longer than most would have, not out of weakness but out of a profound commitment to her family, and to the belief that love, effort, and loyalty could overcome any obstacle. She had held the marriage together through sheer force of will. And when she finally arrived at the moment where she understood that will alone was no longer enough, the decision she made was not one of anger but of grief. She was not fleeing a monster. She was leaving a man she had genuinely loved, deeply and for a very long time, because continuing to stay was costing both of them something they could no longer afford to spend. Keith Urban's response to the divorce has been, in its own way, deeply revealing. His first major public performance after the split was watched with intense scrutiny by fans and media alike. The absence of his wedding ring was noted immediately. The emotional intensity of his stage presence was undeniable. And sources reported that in certain songs, lyrics had been subtly altered, small but unmistakable changes that hinted at a reckoning with personal history. There was no love song dedicated to Nicole. There was no public plea or display of longing. What there was instead was the image of a man stepping back into himself, back into the identity he carried before the marriage, the troubadour, the restless road poet, the country music romantic who belongs to no one place and perhaps no one person. For Nicole, his response confirmed something she already understood. They had become better as individuals than they were as a couple. The love had been real, but the life they had built together had gradually become more about maintaining the story than living it genuinely. And she, more than anyone, understood what it meant to play a role so long and so well that you lose track of where the performance ends and the person begins. When we talk about Nicole Kidman exposing Keith Urban, it would be easy and wrong to imagine a bitter woman seeking revenge or vindication. That is not what is happening. What Nicole is doing is something quieter, braver, and ultimately more significant. She is telling the truth about the invisible labor of being a woman who loves a complicated man. She is exposing not Keith as a villain, but a pattern that society rarely names directly. The pattern of women who become emotional caretakers in their marriages, who pour their strength into propping up a partner, who maintain the public image, manage the private chaos, raise the children, sustain the careers, and do all of this while appearing effortlessly composed. She is exposing what it costs to be the anchor. What it costs to visit someone in rehab 4 months into a marriage and never let the world see you cry. What it costs to smile on a red carpet when your private life is fracturing. What it costs to tell interviewers you have never been stronger when the truth is far more complicated. She is exposing, with grace and without malice, the gap between the fairy tale and the reality. And in doing so, she is offering something valuable not just to her own story but to every woman who has ever stayed too long in a role that was slowly diminishing her. The marriage to Keith Urban was not a mistake. Let that be clear. It produced 2 daughters she adores completely. It gave her years of genuine love and connection. It helped her rebuild after the devastation of her first marriage. But it also asked too much of her for too long, and she is now, finally, honest about that truth. Nicole Kidman is 57 years old. She is one of the most respected and decorated actresses of her generation. She has survived divorce before and rebuilt spectacularly. She has faced the loss of children, public scrutiny of a kind most people cannot imagine, and the particular loneliness of being constantly watched while feeling deeply unseen. And she has survived all of it with her intelligence, her artistry, and her fundamental dignity completely intact. What lies ahead for her now is, for the first time in nearly 20 years, entirely unscripted. There is no marriage to protect, no image to maintain in partnership with someone else, no constant negotiation between her needs and his. For a woman who spent so long being someone's anchor, that freedom must feel both terrifying and deeply, quietly liberating. Those close to her say she is focusing on her daughters, on her work, and on something she has rarely allowed herself in recent years, the simple act of being, without the weight of someone else's fragility pressing down on her. Keith Urban, for his part, is a man whose road has always been paved with reinvention. He has survived addiction, obscurity, heartbreak, and the particular cruelty of an industry that builds you up and tears you apart without sentiment. He will find his way. He always has. But the era of his marriage to Nicole, the era of that particular partnership and all the beauty and burden it carried, is now over. The end of Nicole Kidman and Keith Urban is not a story about failure. It is a story about 2 people who tried, genuinely and for a long time, to be what each other needed, and who ultimately discovered that love, no matter how real, cannot always overcome the fundamental incompatibilities of 2 people's deepest needs. She needed peace. He needed freedom. She craved stability. He was constitutionally restless. For 19 years, they negotiated those differences with varying degrees of success and suffering. And now, they have chosen, with apparent mutual exhaustion and without apparent malice, to stop negotiating. What Nicole is exposing is not a man's flaws. It is the truth of a marriage, complicated and human and impossible to reduce to a simple narrative of hero and villain. She is exposing what it means to love someone through their darkest chapters and emerge from that love changed, wearied, and ultimately, finally, ready to choose yourself. The fairy tale is over. The woman who lived it is still standing. And she is, at last, telling her own